Chapter 19. It was still hours before dark. During a lull in the planning, Mikhail took Isabella to a safe-house apartment close to the bar. Although the safe-house was considerably smaller than his penthouse, the bathroom was still well appointed. She decided to take a hot shower to help clear her mind from the day's disaster so far and give Mikhail space to keep making calls. It had been a nightmare of a day. She was on administrative leave. Harper was missing and being framed for murder. And now Damon was kidnapped by a psychotic werewolf with a grudge against her romantic interest. The shower had multiple heads and took a few minutes to figure out. It had washed away the day's physical grime and left Isabella smelling great, but tension still coiled in her muscles. She ran her fingers through her damp hair, still getting used to the feel of the borrowed clothes. Soft cotton tactical pants and a buttoned short-sleeve blouse that hung loosely on her frame, clearly meant for someone taller. The fabric carried an unfamiliar scent. Clean, but not her usual detergent. Isabella padded barefoot across the safe-house apartment, taking closer stock of her surroundings. The space occupied the top floor of an unassuming building in a neighborhood that had once been industrial, but was gradually transforming into artist lofts and tech startups. She moved to the dirty windows, watching the sunset slowly approach. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman transformed from the polished prosecutor who had dominated courtrooms just days ago to someone worried about her friend's life. Behind her, Mikhail prowled through the space, securing doors and checking comm devices. His movements made barely a sound despite his size, only the occasional soft click of a lock or tap of a keypad marking his progress. The apartment had the stamp of his usual preferences that she was beginning to be able to recognize. Minimalist luxury with subtle security features. Reinforced doors disguised with modern wood paneling that was too thick to be standard. Windows that appeared normal, but were undoubtedly bulletproof from the slight distortion at the edges. Sightlines were carefully managed to prevent observation from neighboring buildings. An alpha's den designed for both comfort and defense. The air inside carried subtle notes of leather from the furniture, cedar wood from the bookshelves that lined one wall, and the faint herbal scent from what appeared to be a collection of plants, maintained in a small indoor garden near the kitchen. Practical plants like rosemary and lavender rather than decorative species. The space was warmer than she would have kept in her apartment. Isabella shifted her weight, acutely aware of being alone with him again, since the evening at his penthouse. Neither had mentioned what had happened between them, that frantic, intense coupling that had left marks on her skin that had only recently faded. The memory of his hands on her body, his mouth against her neck, flashed unbidden through her mind, and she straightened her posture, trying to focus on the city beyond the glass. The reconnaissance of the water treatment facility had confirmed their suspicions. Viktor's forces had established a perimeter with concentrated security around the northeast chemical storage section. When they returned, the smell of chemical residue and rust had clung to the scouts' clothing, a physical reminder of the abandoned facility's decrepit condition. Thermal imaging from Katerina's team had identified approximately 20 armed guards, plus several heat signatures that registered differently. Werewolves. Isabella now understood, their body temperature running higher than humans. Their rescue operation was planned for pre-dawn, when the mercenaries' night shift would be at their most fatigued and visibility conditions would favor Mikhail and the team's enhanced senses, which left them with hours of waiting, hours of tension, hours for Isabella to process everything that had happened since she first saw that ritualistic murder victim in her case files. Bodies that now had meaning beyond human crime. Markers in a territorial war she hadn't known existed beneath the surface of her city. "You should rest." Mikhail's voice came from behind her, closer than she'd expected. For a creature of his size, he moved with impossible silence. The scent of him, that wild electric smell like air before a storm, reached her before his words did, now mingled with the copper note of blood and the earthy scent of the tunnels they'd travelled. The familiar scent brought back visceral memories of his body pressed against hers, his scent overwhelming her senses as they'd moved together. "I don't think rest is an option tonight," she replied, not turning from the window. Her fingers absently brushed the gun holster on her right hip. She had put the holster back on after her shower. While she doubted she'd need it immediately, the weight of the weapon was a comfort to her after Damon's earlier abduction. Mikhail's reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, his presence solid and warm at her back. Even in reflection, his eyes held that unnatural clarity, seeing more than any human could in the low light of the apartment. The city lights caught in his irises, making them glow slightly from within. "Your heart rate is elevated. Your body needs recovery time before tomorrow morning." Isabella raised an eyebrow at his reflection, a gesture that had cowed many witnesses, but seemed to amuse him simply. The last time they'd been this close, without others present. That heat had been pressed against every inch of her skin. "Is monitoring my vital signs a lichen ability, or just your particular talent?" A hint of that rare smile touched his lips, softening the hard planes of his face. The expression transformed him, creating momentary dimples at the corners of his mouth that seemed at odds with his otherwise intimidating presence. "Enhanced senses. I can hear your heartbeat, detect subtle changes in your scent that indicate stress or fatigue." There was a deliberate pause before he added, "Among other things." The implication hung between them. He could sense her physical response to his proximity, just as he had that night. Heat rose to Isabella's cheeks, but she refused to look away from his reflection. That must make poker night challenging. She allowed herself the small joke, a pressure valve for the tension that had been building. His smile deepened slightly, revealing a hint of the charm that must be carefully controlled in his role as alpha. The expression reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and softening his usual intensity. "I'm banned from most casinos in the southeast." The unexpected humor broke some of the tension that had been building since the club, though the other tension, the one vibrating between their bodies since that night, remained. Isabella turned to face him, leaning against the window. The cooling glass at her back contrasted with the warmth of the apartment, creating a pleasant sensory counterpoint. "So, you can hear heartbeats, track by scent, see in the dark, and send emotional telegrams to your pack members. What other abilities should I know about before tomorrow?" Her question was professional, but they both knew she'd experienced some of those abilities firsthand. His strength as he'd lifted her against the glass windows, his heightened senses that had allowed him to respond to her every reaction, the accelerated healing that had erased the scratches she'd left down his back. At the same time, her own marks had lingered for days. Mikhail considered her question with characteristic seriousness, hands clasped behind his back. In that formal posture she was beginning to recognize as his default stance, so different from the uninhibited way he'd moved with her that night. The soft lighting from recessed fixtures caught in his dark hair, highlighting threads of silver that weren't visible in daylight. Enhanced strength and speed, even in human form. Accelerated healing, except for silver wounds. Heightened senses. I can hear conversations a few buildings away if I focus. That would have been useful during some of my cross-examinations, Isabella mused, picturing how effectively she could have dismantled alibis with such abilities. The mental image brought a small smile to her lips, a deliberate shift to safer conversational ground. You seem to manage intimidation quite effectively without supernatural advantages, Mikhail observed, and Isabella wasn't entirely sure if he was teasing or complimenting her. His expression remained serious, but something in his eyes suggested amusement, a warmth that hadn't been there during their earlier strategic planning, the same heat she'd glimpsed when he'd looked down at her that night. His control momentarily fractured. She pushed away from the window, moving to the kitchen where she added ice to a glass and poured herself some water. The simple action helped ground her, a normal human moment in this decidedly abnormal situation. The cool liquid soothed her throat, dry from the underground bar and tension. Ice clinked against glass, the sound homey and ordinary in the sleek kitchen with its brushed steel appliances and polished stone countertops. Isabella stared down at her glass. Was Viktor always so extreme in his views? Mikhail was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of history Isabella could scarcely imagine. Viktor was once considered progressive among our kind. He was the first alpha in our territory to establish permanent residence, to accumulate wealth and influence in human society rather than living nomadically. What changed him? Isabella dried her hands on a soft towel, watching Mikhail's face for the subtle expressions most would miss. The kitchen towel was expensive, absorbent cotton that felt luxurious against her skin. Another small reminder of the wealth that supported Mikhail's operations. The burden of leadership, the isolation of power. Mikhail's gaze turned distant, seeing memories beyond Isabella's perception. His eyes seemed to focus on something far away, beyond the apartment walls, perhaps beyond the current century. And personal loss? His mate was killed during a territorial dispute with another supernatural faction nearly a century ago. Isabella absorbed this, recognizing the familiar pattern from countless criminal cases. Trauma transforming into violence, grief hardening into hatred. Most vengeful defendants had a story that began with loss. The narrative was so familiar that it created an unexpected pang of sympathy for Viktor, despite the horror of his actions. He became what he feared. A common tragedy among our kind, Mikhail agreed quietly. The wolf nature amplifies emotion. Without control, without pack bonds to anchor us, grief can become rage, and protection can become domination. You can become physically or emotionally injured enough and become what we call a revenant. You called some of Viktor's people that, Isabella said, as she walked into the living room. The polished floors were cool beneath her stockinged feet. She'd removed her shoes earlier, a small concession to comfort after hours of tension. Their paths crossed and realigned with unconscious coordination, as if they'd shared this space for years instead of hours. Yes, He's long collected the most damaged. Revenants are no longer in control of their wolf. Only blood gives them back temporary control over their actions. Otherwise, the beast remains in control. She looked over to where he was leaning against the bar counter. "And what anchors you, Mikhail?" The question emerged more personally than she'd intended. The distance they'd been maintaining felt suddenly fragile in the quiet of the apartment. The memory of his body against hers, the way control had momentarily shattered for both of them, hung unspoken between them. Mikhail walked over to her. Purpose. Responsibility to the pack. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The same piercing gaze that had locked with hers that night as he'd moved above her. The soft lighting caught his face in profile so momentarily, highlighting the aristocratic line of his nose, the strong jaw she had traced with her fingertips in the darkness of the safe house. And more recently, connections I didn't anticipate when you first walked into the gala. The implication hung between them, charged with shared memories. Isabella felt her heartbeat quicken and knew with certainty that he could hear it, just as he had heard every accelerated pulse when his lips had traced patterns down her body. The knowledge should have made her uncomfortable, this creature who could sense her physiological responses. But it created instead the same intimate connection that had overwhelmed her rational mind that night. No pretense was possible between them, not after he had learned her body so thoroughly, mapped her responses with inhuman precision that still haunted her dreams. The night sounds of the city filtered into the apartment. Distant sirens, the hum of traffic, fragments of music from neighboring buildings. "We already crossed that line once," she said. Memories of tangled sheets and desperate touches flashing unbidden through her mind. "How much more complicated do we want to make things for ourselves?" she asked, putting her worry into words. She ran a fingertip along a cushion, seeking something solid to ground her against the pull of wanting to feel his hands on her skin again. "Nothing about that night was simple," Mikhail countered, moving closer with the same predatory grace that had frightened and thrilled her. "But you can't tell me you regret it." His scent enveloped her, achingly familiar now. That distinctive storm-approaching smell surrounding her as they'd moved together. His skin against hers. "I don't do regrets," she replied, standing up and holding her ground as he approached, refusing to retreat despite her body's visceral memory of what happened when they stood this close before. Her back straightened, chin lifting slightly in the same defiant gesture she'd made before he'd lifted her against that wall. But repeating impulsive decisions isn't exactly wise. Is that what it would be? Repeating an impulse? He stopped just short of touching her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the same heat that had burned against every inch of her skin. His voice dropped lower, resonating in a way that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her nervous system. Or rather, would it be acknowledging what's been between us since the beginning? Isabella met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated, even as desire coursed through her, familiar and yet somehow stronger than before. The lawyer in her demanded evidence, reason, and pattern. "We have more important priorities right now. Damon is as secure as we can make him until morning," Mikhail finished, his voice softening. His eyes traced the contours of her face with a gentleness that contrasted with his imposing physicality. "Strategy is set. Teams are in position. There is nothing more we can do for him in these hours. And this? Isabella gestured between them, naming the tension without specifics. Her hand wavered in the space between their bodies. The air itself seemed charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. What is this beyond a distraction? A complication? Perhaps it's neither. Mikhail raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement as if understanding her need for control, for choice. His fingers hovered near her face without touching, a restraint that spoke volumes about his respect for boundaries. Perhaps it's clarity. The restraint in his gesture, this powerful creature who could move faster than her eye could track, choosing to move with deliberate slowness, affected Isabella more profoundly than any touch. It represented respect, acknowledgement of her agency despite their power imbalance. The air between his hand and her cheek seemed to vibrate with potential energy, her skin warming in anticipation of contact not yet made. "I don't trust easily," she said quietly. A confession rather than a rejection. The admission cost her. Vulnerability had never come naturally. Each revealed weakness was carefully calculated in her professional life rather than freely given. "I know." His eyes held hers, undemanding yet intense. The light blue caught the city lights from the window, reflecting them like distant stars. "Your caution is part of what draws me to you. You weigh evidence. You consider the consequences. And right now, I'm considering many." Her voice remained steady, despite the electricity building between them, the charge that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. Professional complications, ethical questions, the fact that we barely know each other. "Don't we?" Mikhail's expression carried a certainty that challenged her statement. The slight curve of his lips wasn't quite a smile, but it softened the intensity of his gaze. "You've seen parts of me that few ever witness. I've observed you for longer than you realize. We've fought together, strategized together." Isabella couldn't deny the truth in his words. Their connection had developed with unnatural speed, forged in crisis and danger. Yet it felt more substantial than any relationship she'd built over conventional timelines. A recognition between them transcended time, as if they'd known each other in some essential way from that first confrontation at the gala. The memory of that night seemed impossibly distant now, belonging to a different version of herself. "And now, we stand at a threshold," she acknowledged, maintaining the careful distance between them. The sounds of nighttime Atlanta drifted up from below. Music from a club several blocks away, a distant car horn, the ambient hum of a city, unaware of the supernatural war being waged beneath its surface. One certainty exists. Mikhail's voice deepened slightly, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through her bones. His eyes held hers with unwavering focus, its impact almost physical. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I will protect you with my life. Not out of obligation or strategy, but because the thought of harm coming to you is unacceptable to me." The simple declaration, delivered with absolute conviction, shifted something fundamental between them. Isabella recognized the significance of such a statement from an alpha werewolf, a commitment beyond ordinary protection. From anyone else, such words might have seemed possessive or controlling. From him, understanding the culture he came from was a profound pledge. "I'm not seeking a protector," she said, even as something within her responded to his words. Her independence had defined her for too long to surrender it, even in the face of supernatural threats. The declaration was softened by the slight tremor in her voice, a vulnerability she rarely allowed others to witness. Number, you're too formidable to need one. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, that rare smile transforming his features. The expression created a momentary dimple that softened his intimidating presence, making him seem younger. Consider it a partnership instead. Partnership. The word resonated with Isabella's independent nature far better than protection or possession. It suggested equality despite their different strengths, complementary roles rather than dominance. She appreciated the precise terminology and the boundaries it established. The city lights through the window painted shifting patterns across the floor between them. Isabella made her decision, deliberately closing the distance between them. Her hand rose to touch his face, fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The first time she had initiated contact between them that wasn't about his injury. His skin was warm beneath her touch, the slight rasp of stubble against her fingertips unexpectedly sensual. A partnership requires trust. Mikhail remained perfectly still under her touch, though she felt a tremor run through him. His control was palpable, a force he maintained with visible effort. His jaw muscles flexed slightly beneath her fingers, the only outward indication of his response. Yes. And transparency. Her fingers moved to the collar of his shirt, lingering at the edge of the fabric. The fine cotton was soft beneath her touch, warm from his body heat. She could feel his pulse beneath her fingertips, strong and slightly faster than human normal. There needs to be a balance in vulnerability. That's fair, he agreed, his eyes darkening as they followed her movements. His pupils expanded, nearly overtaking the light blue of his irises, a physical response he couldn't control. His scent shifted subtly. Isabella stepped closer, her body nearly touching his. The height difference between them should have made her feel small. Instead, it created a delicious tension, a complementary fit. The warmth of his body radiated against her, a stark contrast to the cool air flowing from the night outside. Then show me, Mikhail. Not just the controlled alpha, not just the strategic leader. Show me what lies beneath.